Our society is great at producing things in staggering amounts. One of the most important things we create are our stories, our entertainment. As thinking, self-aware creatures, there's a great importance in our ability to conceive of great dramas, comedies, and tragedies, and to take inventory of our own feelings in relation to these external characters. By doing so, we grow ourselves as more complex and emotionally intelligent individuals, all while being enthralled with fantastic sights, sounds, and scenarios. To that end, we love great storytellers and writers who can capture this abstract magic. But as anyone who's old enough or wise enough to have suffered will tell you, sometimes life gets rough. Sometimes things aren't as insulated as our experience as children might suggest. In terms of our natural development, we as a species are largely incapable of self-preservation until at least the later childhood years. While our modern conveniences have eliminated the need for daily hunting, we still carry over and adapt these evolutionary values to our daily activities. So when it comes to the development of our children, we tend to, like I said, insulate them from the more complicated, morally dubious concepts they'll encounter later on. Now, there's an argument here as to whether or not this itself allows them to transition effectively, and then a further debate about what kinds of concepts or activities you need to shield kids from. I mean, after all, it's the things we censor that we tend to be most curious about. And that kind of over-censorship leads to kids who are playing Call of Duty and giving each other blowjobs in middle school. There's a way to have a balance without overly sheltering your kids or overexposing them to things they should learn about at a later date in a more natural way. And that leaves us back at the topic of media. Well, let's start with kids then. What media is for them? What media is for kids? Well, certainly kids' media is that which is intended to educate and/or entertain kids of an age that would be considered too young for more risque or violent content. Sex, violence, and drugs. These are the holy trinity we can wrap up under the umbrella term vulgarity for simplicity's sake. Now, there's an entire debate that could be had about what age we should consider the arbitrary starting point for kids to learn about vulgar things, but that's too far of a departure for the topic here, so let's act like lawmakers and just say 10 to 12 is the minimum age kids should reach before they're exposed to that kind of material. I do think parents should be honest with their kids if approached with questions about sex, love, death, violence, and so on, but that's up for the parents to decide, not the media. So we'll leave that at that and move on. Now, does all children's content have to be educational? Probably not, but going back to our developmental roots, growing up we need a chance to grow both physically and mentally. Look at the famous cases of feral children and what happens when a human isn't socialized. It's almost scary to think how much development can be wiped clean if a kid is just somehow able to survive on its own, but without a grown-up role model. So while not every piece of children's media has to be educational, it makes sense from a strictly utilitarian standpoint that if kids require, quote-unquote, getting up to speed with the world, that we should probably include the most minimal amounts of education wherever possible into their entertainment. I mean, I think we should do that with adults too, so they don't turn out so fucking stugats, but... So from an adult perspective, the ideal children's media is that which is free of an excess of vulgar content, or at least free of shoving it directly into the children's faces, and educational where possible without being boring and thus defeating the purpose.
Animation!
Animation exists as an unfortunate medium that is almost exclusively associated with children's content. But why is that? Well, the simplest answer I can give is that animation was intended upon its invention to be a marvelous spectacle of technological achievement. I'm aware that there are early viewfinder slides you might consider prototype hentai, and that cartoons like Betty Boop had a distinctively sexual design, but by and large, early cartoons were meant to be doorbusters and marvels, a true experience, if you will. Just look at early movies. Some of the first motion pictures were basically animated GIFs by today's standards. Let's say you're an entrepreneur and you're showing off one of the world's first animations. I'm willing to bet you want to make it wholesome enough that adults and children alike can enjoy it. That way you're not alienating either potential market. So taking that mentality going further and further into animation's history, and given how there's been several periods in that short history where animation was considered an expensive luxury for investors, it's not hard to see how making something appealing for all ages is kind of the default mode, especially for those big studios. Plus, it just so happened that Disney helped push the stereotype that cartoons are for kids due to the high-quality nature of their work being all ages inclusive and setting an example other studios would try to follow. They kind of established a norm. Now, I'm sure other factors like budgetary restraints and some kind of psychological data about kids' receptiveness to cartoons plays into this, but for the sake of staying on topic and brevity, let's just agree that animation has a perception among normies, the middle hump of the bell curve if you will, as being youth-oriented. Why do I bring up animation anyway? Well, it's because it's the dominant zone where the idea of kids' content and mature content overlap. With COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, up and coming, I think it's important to look at where the line between content for kids and content for everyone else is defined. Since we defined what kids' content is, let's look at what adult content is. Well, suppose you have a show that's animated and doesn't outright deal with any vulgar subjects, but is centered around a plot about, say, paying taxes. The main conflict in this animated show is paying taxes. So here we have a non-vulgar, non-offensive piece of animation. While not being so vulgar as to be confined strictly to the realm of adult-only content, does this sound like something kids would want to watch? The subject matter is mature, if not a bit dry, but how do we define who content is created for based purely on the subject? If subject matter is the main determinant in figuring out what audience something is for, then any episode of South Park that parodies kids content like Chim Pokemon should also be for kids. Now, of course, we know this isn't true because South Park also contains a lot of cursing and violence, but if you took those elements out, is South Park now just for kids? Does the removal of vulgar aspects change the content of the original intent of the art? Would Family Guy be kid-friendly if you could edit out or dub over every curse or sexual reference? In the earlier hypothetical show, we described a plain, maybe even a little boring show that doesn't really deal with anything particularly interesting, but it also doesn't deal with vulgarity. Does this mean that adult-only content, quote-unquote, has some kind of arbitrary quota for vulgarity? Clearly, the definition of adult content is in reference to those works that are excessively vulgar, shocking, or mature. So other than works that are excessively vulgar, what should mature but more subtle programs like King of the Hill be considered? Well, we obviously can't just call them kids shows by virtue of not being considered adult entertainment, but then I don't think most people would call King of Queens or Seinfeld kids shows despite their lack of excessive vulgarity. Obviously, our labeling of things as adult is meant to benefit the kids, or rather the parents of kids. Just ask the naive parents who took their tots to see Sausage Party. But the implication that every piece of adult or rather non-kid media is defined by excessive vulgarity exclusively is wrong, both objectively and in principle. All of this begs the question, do we need to segregate our media by age group? Well, let's break that down. There's two ways to segregate media, and each is focused on what we consider to be the default viewer. The first is for all ages. All ages censorship assumes the default viewer is anyone aged child to adult. While this doesn't cater specifically to children, it means all content must be suitable for them from a passing glance. Many cartoons get unfairly labeled as for kids due to their placement on specific networks. Look at shows like Gumball, Ed, Edd n Eddy, and Invader Zim. These shows toe the line between what the most sensitive Puritans would consider okay for kids or not by way of their tone, satire, humor, and situations, but they also do not contain overt sex, drugs, or excessive gore, so they're considered okay. Again, the entire situation really comes down to arbitrary sets of standards. On the inverse, if all content were labeled as adult by default, then kids would be excluded from most media. On the bright side, responsibility would fall more on the irresponsible parents for knowing that all things are for adults except where specifically labeled otherwise, but they probably still fuck up. Here's the thing you may have realized when I laid out these examples, however. We already do both of these simultaneously. Both of these modes of age-related censorship can't coexist in a mass media market and function properly. Especially not where government regulatory agencies are meant to come up with laws that police the way platforms like YouTube. It's all so stupid. Well, like I said earlier, it all comes down to money. As I explained with animation, the most profitable content, let alone all goods and services, are those that are capable of being marketed to kids and adults. Gravity Falls is a good example. Pokemon has a huge demographic of older fans who've been playing since they were kids. Even something like My Little Pony transcended its target demographic, though I can't imagine why. This is all fine and good, and many media companies even realize this and cater their marketing towards skew a little older. But frankly, in all of this, it's the even younger kids who television executives, YouTube, and the government feel need protecting. So let's conclude this video first by looking at what the kids are into these days, and making some observations afterwards. So what are the kids into exactly? Hold on. So what are the kids into? I sound like hello, fellow kids. So what are the kids into these days? So what are the kids into? So what are the kids? I can't do it. So what are the kids into these days? I mean, Blue's Clues is being remade for a new generation, along with Bananas in Pajamas, just two examples from shows I watched as a young kid. But here's the thing. In that gap of about 4 years old to about 9 to 10, even 12 or so, kids develop some very different tastes. Today's kids, if you weren't aware, are into, the shooting games like Fortnite, Call of Duty, but they're also into things like horror games like Five Nights at Freddy's, or Apex Legends, which is just continuing that trend of Battle Royale games, and, well, God knows what else. Some of these games are incredibly intense. I mean, I wouldn't even want to play Five Nights at Freddy's myself. I hated going to Chuck E. Cheese when I was a kid. I hate those damn animatronics. But is anyone really shocked to hear that kids go out of their way to absorb content that's considered inappropriate for them? More kids have access to smartphones and their parents' tablets and the internet now than ever. I mean, when I was a kid, we had a desktop with Windows 98 and an internet connection, and I probably could have looked up porn, but I didn't even know about sex until I was older than what I'm assuming the average kid is when they find out about it. And look, I don't mean to sound like some evangelical purist here, that I'm shocked that these kids are doing such naughty things or whatever. I mean, we all did bad things or watched movies or content we weren't supposed to when we were younger. Kids in the 80s watched Die Hard and RoboCop and Chucky when they weren't supposed to. So, what I'll conclude this video by saying is, what I predicted the situation was from the onset has proven itself to be true. All this COPPA business, yeah, it's not that the kids have changed. If anything, they've gotten worse. There's no love lost for their innocence, okay? That fucking ship has sailed. Now it's the government that's changed, and the amount of regulation. Hey, Dusk here, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, smash the fuck out of that like button and subscribe. I've got plenty of new content planned for what I'm calling 2020, the year of Dusk. Anyway, you can always follow me on Twitter under Dusk Legend for more info on upcoming projects. And, please consider donating to my Patreon, I've sold out, to keep my content independent. Once again, thanks for watching and have a great one.